We were just sharing cheap beer on a hot afternoon, until a terrified boy appeared, pointed at our bikes, and whispered 3 words that pulled us into a war we thought we'd already won. The sun beat down on the asphalt outside the rusty spur, making the chrome on our hogs gleam so bright it hurt to look at. It was a Tuesday, which meant cheap beer and the kind of lazy quiet that settles over a town when everyone's at work. Everyone except us. There were about a dozen of us from the chapter scattered around the patio, the familiar scent of stale beer, leather, and gasoline hanging heavy in the hot air. I was nursing a lukewarm bottle, listening to Gunnar, our club president, lay out the plans for the weekend run up to Eagle Rock. It was routine, comfortable. The low rumble of our conversation was the only sound, a predator's purr in the sleepy afternoon. That's when I saw him. A little kid, couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, standing at the edge of the parking lot. He was small and wiry, with big dark eyes that were fixed on our line of bikes. We get lookers all the time, folks admiring the iron horses we pour our blood, sweat, and money into. But this was different. The kid wasn't admiring. He was terrified. He kept darting his gaze from our bikes to the clubhouse door, like he was expecting a monster to come roaring out. Spike, one of our newer prospects, noticed him too. "Hey, kid, get lost before you scratch something," he barked, his voice harsher than necessary. The boy flinched, but he didn't run. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. His hands were clenched into tiny fists at his sides. I could see his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. Something felt off. The air, which had been lazy and thick, now felt charged, electric, with a tension that had nothing to do with the impending heat of the afternoon. Gunnar held up a hand, silencing Spike. He just watched the boy, his expression unreadable behind his thick beard and sunglasses. The kid took another shaky step onto our asphalt, his worn-out sneakers scuffing on the gravel. He was looking right at Gunnar now, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperate determination. He stopped about 20 feet away from our table, close enough for us to hear his voice, which came out as a squeaky, breathless whisper. You gotta look," he stammered, his eyes flicking over the row of polished Harleys. Every brother on that patio was silent now, watching him. This wasn't a prank. You could see the genuine fear etched on the boy's face. Gunnar leaned forward slightly, his massive forearms resting on the table. "Look at what, son?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, surprisingly gentle. The boy swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin neck. He pointed a trembling finger towards our bikes, the very symbols of our freedom and power, parked proudly in a perfect row. "Under them," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Look under your bikes. Now." And with that, he turned and ran. He didn't just jog away. He sprinted, his little legs pumping like pistons, not even looking back as he disappeared around the corner of the adjacent building. For a second, nobody moved. We just stared at the empty space where he'd been standing. Spike let out a nervous laugh. "Crazy kid," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Gunnar stood up, scraping his chair back against the concrete. The sound was loud and jarring in the sudden silence. He didn't say a word. He just started walking towards his bike, a massive, custom-built street glide that was his pride and joy. We all followed, a sense of unease creeping over us like a cold shadow. I walked over to my Dyna, the one I'd spent the last 5 years perfecting. Everything looked fine. The paint was flawless, the chrome sparkled. It was my baby. "What are we looking for?" Spike asked, peering around his own bike nervously. Gunnar didn't answer. He just got down on one knee, his old joints cracking in protest, and peered under the chassis of his bike. He was still for a long moment. Then, slowly, He reached underneath. When his hand came back out, he was holding something small and black, no bigger than a matchbox. He stood up, turning it over in his calloused palm. It had a small magnetic strip on one side and a tiny blinking green light on the other. My blood ran cold. I'd seen devices like that before, in movies. We all got down, checking our own bikes. A chorus of curses filled the air as, one by one, we all found them. Identical black boxes, tucked away in the shadows of our engines and frames, clinging like parasites to the steel. There was one on every single bike. Every single one. Gunnar held his up for all of us to see, his face a mask of cold fury. "They're not trying to steal our bikes, brothers," he growled, his voice dangerously low. "They're hunting us." And as he said it, the sun caught the device in his hand just right, and I saw it. A tiny, almost invisible scorpion etched into the plastic casing. The scorpion, the symbol of the Los Escorpiones. A ghost story we told prospects to scare them straight. A Mexican cartel that had tried to push north into our territory a decade ago. We'd pushed back. Hard. We buried their leader, Ricardo Vargas, in an unmarked grave somewhere in the desert and sent his lieutenants packing, thinking we'd cut the head off the snake for good. Clearly we were wrong. The snake had just been waiting, growing new fangs. And these fangs were digital. Gunnar crushed the tracker in his fist, the plastic crunching under the force of his grip. The blinking green light went out. "Get 'em off, all of 'em," he commanded, his voice like grinding rock. "No phones, no radios. They're listening. Get inside. Now." The patio was a blur of frantic motion. Brothers were on their backs, ripping the magnetic boxes from the underbellies of their bikes, throwing them into a pile on the asphalt. The feeling of violation was palpable. Our clubhouse, our sanctuary, had been breached. Our hogs, extensions of our own souls, had been desecrated. Someone had walked right into our den, marked us for slaughter, and walked out without anyone noticing. Inside, the mood was even darker. The blinds were drawn, plunging the room into a dusty gloom. Gunnar stood in the middle of the floor, the pile of trackers on the bar in front of him. "They know we know," he said, stating the obvious, "which means their timeline just got moved up. They're not going to wait to pick us off one by one anymore. They're coming for all of us." A heavy silence hung in the room. This wasn't a rival club looking for a street fight. The Escorpiones were different. They were narcos, military trained, and they didn't play by any rules we recognized. They didn't want our turf. They wanted us erased. "The kid," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "He warned us. He's the key." All eyes turned to me. "He knew," I continued. "He knew what these were and who put them here. We need to find him." Gunnar nodded slowly, his eyes narrowed in thought. "He can't have gone far. He was on foot." He pointed at me and Spike. "You two, go find him. Don't spook him. He saved our asses. We owe him that much. Find out what he knows. The rest of you, we lock this place down. We're going to war." Spike and I grabbed our cuts but left our bikes. We didn't want the noise, and for the first time in my life, I didn't trust my ride. We headed out on foot, moving fast down the street in the direction the boy had run. The neighborhood behind the bar was a maze of run-down duplexes and cracked sidewalks. Kids' toys were scattered on yellowing lawns. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. "How are we supposed to find one kid in all this?" Spike muttered, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife on his belt. "We look for somewhere he'd feel safe," I said, scanning the alleys and backyards. "He was scared. He's hiding." We spent the next hour searching, asking a few people if they'd seen a little boy running, but got nothing but suspicious stares. The sun was starting to dip lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood red. Hope was starting to fade. We were about to head back when I saw it, lying near a storm drain. A small green plastic army man half melted from the sun, but one arm was still raised holding a tiny rifle. It was the kind of cheap toy you'd get from a vending machine. I picked it up. It felt like a sign. I scanned the area again, and my eyes landed on a dingy, 2-story apartment building at the end of the block. The paint was peeling, and a few windows were boarded up. It looked like the kind of place you go when you have nowhere else to run. "There," I said to Spike, pointing with the toy soldier. We crossed the street, our boots silent on the broken pavement. The front door of the building was propped open with a brick. The hallway inside smelled of mildew and despair. There were 4 doors on the ground floor. We listened at each one. Nothing. We headed up the creaking stairs to the second floor. More silence. Only one door, apartment 2B, had a faint light showing from underneath. I motioned for Spike to stay back, and I crept closer, pressing my ear against the thin wood. I could hear voices inside. A child's soft, fearful mumble, and then a man's voice, calm and chillingly gentle. It was a voice that spoke with a slight accent, a voice that turned my blood to ice because I'd heard it before, on a crackly recording from a decade ago, right before we put his brother in the ground. "You did well, Miguel," the voice said. "You told them just like I said. Now the real fun can begin." It was Hector Vargas, and he was talking to the little boy who had just saved our lives. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure adrenaline. Hector Vargas. Alive. Here. I looked back at Spike, my eyes wide, and held a single finger to my lips. He understood immediately, his hand going to his knife as his face hardened. I didn't have my piece we'd left in too much of a hurry, and kicking in the door would be suicide. Vargas wouldn't be alone. I could hear the faint murmur of at least one other person in the room. This wasn't a rescue mission anymore. It was a recon. We had to get out, get back to the club, and tell Gunnar. The Escorpiones weren't just coming. They were already inside the gates. I eased back from the door, my movements slow and deliberate, my boots making no sound on the grimy linoleum. Spike and I retreated down the stairs, our backs pressed against the wall, every creak of the old building sounding like a gunshot. Once we hit the street, we didn't run. We walked fast and purposeful, melting back into the twilight shadows. The whole way back my mind raced. The boy, Miguel, wasn't a savior. He was bait, a pawn in a sick game. Vargas had sent him to us knowing we'd find the trackers. He wanted us to find them. He wanted us on high alert, locked down in our clubhouse, a perfect, consolidated target. He wasn't hunting us in the wild. He was laying a siege. We burst through the doors of the Rusty Spur to find the clubhouse transformed into a makeshift fortress. Windows were barricaded, and the brothers were armed to the teeth, their faces grim. "Vargas," I gasped, leaning against the doorframe to catch my breath. "Hector Vargas is alive. He's here. He has the kid." The name fell like a bomb in the crowded room. Old-timers who'd been there for the first war straightened up, their eyes flashing with a familiar deadly light. Gunnar strode over, his face like a thundercloud. "Where?" I gave him the address, explaining what I'd heard. He slammed a massive fist on the bar. "It's a trap," he growled. "He wants us to storm that apartment. He'll have a kill box set up, pick us off before we even get up the stairs." He was right. A direct assault was exactly what Vargas would expect from us. We were Hell's Angels. We kicked in doors. But this time, that would get us all killed. "We don't go to him," I said, an idea forming in the chaos of my mind. "We make him come to us." I looked at the pile of disabled trackers on the bar. "He thinks he's got us cornered. He sent the boy to make us panic, to make us predictable. So let's be predictable." Gunnar looked at me, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Spit it out." I took a deep breath. "We give him the fight he wants, but not where he wants it. Spike and I go back, but we don't go in. We make noise, we draw them out. The rest of you, you're the welcome wagon. It was a crazy plan, maybe even a stupid one, but it was better than sitting here waiting for the firebomb to come through the window. An hour later, Spike and I were back on that darkened street, but this time we weren't on foot. We were on our bikes, the guttural roar of my Dyna and his Sportster shattering the night silence. We screamed down the block, our headlights cutting through the gloom, and skidded to a stop right in front of the apartment building. "Vargas!" I yelled, my voice echoing off the brick facades. "You want a war? You got one. Come and get us, you coward." We revved our engines, a symphony of defiance. The light in the second-floor window went out. A moment later, the front door of the building burst open. It wasn't just Vargas. 4 men armed with automatic weapons spilled out onto the street, their faces contorted with rage. They were expecting 2 bikers. They weren't expecting the dozen others who emerged from the alleys and shadows behind them, a wall of leather and steel blocking their only escape route. And they definitely weren't expecting Gunner, who stepped out from behind a parked car, leveling a shotgun. The firefight was short, brutal, and loud. The cartel thugs were disciplined, but we were fighting on our home turf, fueled by a decade of simmering hatred. When the smoke cleared, Vargas was on his knees, a bloody wound in his shoulder, surrounded. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with disbelief and venom. "How?" he snarled. Before I could answer, the apartment door opened again. The little boy, Miguel, stood there, his eyes wide with terror. He looked at the carnage, at his uncle on the ground, and then at me. I saw it then. Not the face of a traitor, but of a hostage. Vargas had been using his own nephew, his dead brother's son, as a shield and a pawn. Gunner walked over and stood before Vargas, the shotgun still smoking. "You came into our house, used a child, and thought you could wipe us out," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "You forgot something about snakes, Hector. You cut off the head, but we're the kind that grows back meaner." The police and ambulances arrived eventually, drawn by the thunder of the gun battle. Vargas and his surviving crew were hauled away, destined for a concrete box that would make a desert grave seem like a paradise. The state took Miguel into protective custody. As they led him to a car, he looked over at me, his small face unreadable. I just gave him a slow, single nod. He'd been forced to set the trap, but in the end, he'd also given us the key to survive it. We were battered and shaken, but we were alive. The war was over, for now. We loaded our bikes onto a flatbed, not trusting them until they were stripped and swept clean, and walked back to the spur in the pre-dawn quiet, a silent, grim procession. We had faced the ghosts of our past and won, and we'd learned a hard lesson. Sometimes the most important warnings come in the smallest whispers.